Did you know that Brazil was the last country in the West to abolish slavery? For more than 300 years, millions of Africans were torn from their lands, separated from their families, and sold as merchandise in one of the cruelest chapters in history, the slave trade. The crossing on slave ships became known as the Passage of Death, and it was no coincidence. Crammed into dark holds, starving, sick and chained, many did not survive the long journey across the Atlantic. Those who did were auctioned off in slave markets and taken to slave quarters, where they would spend their lives under whippings, punishments, and inhumane days of forced labor. But the history of slavery in Brazil is not made only of pain and suffering. It is also a story of resistance, men and women who fought against the whipping post, who escaped to form quilombos, who preserved their culture, their faith, and their hope in the midst of oppression. They were the ones who, even without weapons, challenged the power of plantation owners and colonial elites. In this video, you will discover the hidden truth about the trade of souls that sustained the colonial economy, fueled sugar mills, gold mines, and coffee plantations, and left deep marks on structural racism and social inequality that are still part of our reality today. If you want to understand the roots of Brazil, comprehend the struggle of black people, and reflect on the legacy of more than 300 years of slavery, this is the right place. Stay with me until the end, because this is not just a story of the past, but a key to understanding the present and building a fairer future. The history of slavery in Brazil begins right after the arrival of the Portuguese in American lands in the 16th century. At first, the exploitation of indigenous labor was the first attempt at economic support. Native peoples were forced to work in sugarcane fields, in mills, and in the collection of natural products. But indigenous resistance, combined with partial protection from the church in some regions, led colonizers to seek an alternative, the importation of enslaved Africans. It was in this context that the slave trade gained strength. Slave ships left from different ports in West Africa loaded with men, women, and children who were treated as mere commodities. The slave trade was not just a detail of the colonial process, but the very pillar that sustained the entire economy. Sugar, the main export product, depended directly on enslaved labor to thrive. The justification used by colonizers to legitimize the slave trade mixed religion and economy. They preached that Africans were inferior beings and that their enslavement was a way to civilize them and convert them to Christianity. Behind this discourse was the interest in consolidating a system of exploitation that enriched traffickers, plantation owners, and the Portuguese crown itself. The slave trade was so profitable that it became a true international business, involving networks of European, African, and colonial merchants. This beginning of slavery in Brazil revealed a cruel machine, the transformation of people into merchandise. Africans were captured in local wars or sold by African kingdoms allied with Europeans, transported in inhumane conditions, and destined for a slave market in constant expansion. It was the beginning of more than 300 years of a trade of souls that would leave deep marks on history. And if capture and boarding were already brutal, what happened inside the ships was even more shocking. The next part of this story will reveal how thousands of lives were taken in the terrible Passage of Death. If capture in African lands was already inhumane, the horror intensified the moment captives were placed inside slave ships. These vessels, built to carry goods, were adapted to transport human beings as if they were worthless cargo. It was the beginning of the so-called Passage of Death, a route that connected Africa to Brazil and became one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity. In the holds of the slave ships, men, women, and children were crammed in subhuman conditions. Shackled to one another, they barely had room to lie down or move. The suffocating heat, lack of ventilation and darkness created an environment prone to diseases like scurvy, dysentery, and smallpox. Food was scarce and of terrible quality. A mixture of grains and contaminated water. Many enslaved people did not survive and died before even seeing the shores of Brazil. Mortality rates were alarming. It is estimated that between 15 and 20% of the Africans embarked never completed the journey. Their bodies were thrown into the sea, turning the Atlantic into a silent cemetery. This unprecedented suffering was not limited to the physical. It was also a deep psychological trauma. Separated from their families, stripped of identity and freedom, many chose suicide as their last act of resistance. But not everyone passively accepted the tragedy. There were attempts at rebellion inside the ships, with groups of enslaved people who organized themselves to confront the crew. Although most were suppressed with brutal violence, each uprising was a cry of humanity in the midst of barbarity. This crossing not only marked the body, but also the collective memory. It was a forced ritual of passage that symbolized the loss of homeland and the beginning of a life of exploitation in foreign lands. The transatlantic slave trade became the foundation of colonial commerce, and the slave ships represented the cruel machinery of a system that transformed people into merchandise. However, upon arriving in Brazil, the suffering did not come to an end. On the contrary, for those who survived the passage of death, the reality in the slave quarters and plantations was even harsher, marked by punishments and humiliations. The Africans who managed to survive the passage of death found no rest when stepping onto Brazilian soil. Disembarkation in ports such as Salvador, Recife, and Rio de Janeiro meant the beginning of a new stage of suffering: life in the slave quarters. After being sold at slave auctions as if they were animals, men, women, and children were sent to farms, sugar mills, gold mines, or coffee plantations. The slave quarters, simple structures of clay and wood, were places of collective imprisonment. There, dozens of people crowded together in unhealthy spaces, without hygiene, without privacy, and with little food. They slept on dirt floors, sharing the space with rats and insects. The environment of misery contrasted with the wealth of the big houses, symbols of the power of plantation owners. The work was exhausting. In the sugarcane fields, the enslaved faced the scorching sun and workdays of more than 12 hours daily. In the gold mines, the risk of accidents was constant, and in the coffee plantations, discipline was maintained under the weight of the whip. The whipping post, raised in central squares, was the stage for exemplary punishments. There, the punished received lashings in front of the population to serve as a lesson to the others. The whip, the stocks, and the red-hot iron were part of daily life. Despite the suffering, the enslaved sought ways to preserve their humanity. Music, dance, religious beliefs, and cuisine became instruments of cultural resistance. It was in the slave quarters that African songs were sung, stories were passed on, and hope for freedom was kept alive. Even amid violence and exploitation, the collective spirit grew stronger. This silent resistance worried the masters. Every gesture of solidarity, every ritual, every word in an African language was seen as a threat to the slave order. Life in the slave quarters, marked by pain, was also a space of organization where the flame of rebellion began to be lit. And it was from this flame that escapes and movements emerged, which would become symbols of freedom. In the next chapter, we will dive into the history of rebellions and quilombos, where the fight against slavery gained strength and courage. If life in the slave quarters was marked by pain, it was also there that the flame of resistance was born. Slavery in Brazil was never passively accepted. From the very beginning, enslaved men and women fought against the system, whether through small daily acts of disobedience or in great uprisings that went down in history. The resistance of enslaved Africans became a symbol of courage in the face of oppression. One of the most striking forms of this struggle was the creation of quilombos. These were communities formed by fugitive enslaved people who sought to rebuild their lives in freedom. The most famous of all was the Quilombo of Palmares, located in the region of Alagoas, which resisted for almost 1 century against colonial expeditions. Under the leadership of Zumbi, Palmares became a true African kingdom on Brazilian soil, bringing together thousands of men, women, and children who fled from farms and plantations. But quilombos were not the only form of resistance. There were also organized revolts in cities and plantations. The Malê Revolt, which took place in Salvador in the year 1835, was one of the most well-known. Led by African Muslims, this rebellion showed the power of organization and the determination to achieve freedom. Although it was violently suppressed, it made it clear that slavery was far from being a stable system. Beyond escapes and revolts, resistance was also expressed in the preservation of African culture. Music, dance, African-based religions, and capoeira were ways of keeping identity alive and defying attempts at cultural erasure. Even under the weight of the whipping post, lashings, and constant fear, the enslaved created strategies of survival and collective resistance. The plantation owners and colonial authorities saw every act of resistance as a threat to their power. That is why repressions were brutal, expeditions against quilombos, public executions, exemplary punishments. But even in the face of violence, the flame of freedom was never extinguished. Every escape, every quilombo, every revolt was a reminder that slavery could not completely break the human spirit. This resistance gained strength over the centuries until it became unbearable pressure for the powerful. And while the enslaved fought for their dignity, the elites grew rich with the slave trade, transforming lives into profit. This is exactly what we will see in the next chapter, how the trade of souls sustained the Brazilian economy for more than 300 years. If on one hand, slavery in Brazil represented pain, punishment, and resistance for millions of Africans, on the other, it became one of the most profitable businesses in history for the colonial elite. The slave trade was the machinery that moved the economy, enriching traffickers, plantation owners, European merchants, and even the Portuguese crown. It was a system where every human life was converted into currency. The slave ships did not transport only people. They carried the blood and suffering that fueled an economic empire. Sugar, produced on a large scale in the sugar mills of the Northeast, became the main export product and depended entirely on enslaved labor. Later, the gold mines in Minas Gerais and the coffee plantations in the Southeast further expanded the demand. Colonial and imperial Brazil consolidated itself as a giant producer, but this wealth was built on the brutal exploitation of African men and women. The slave market was organized like any other business. There were intermediaries who negotiated with African kingdoms, traffickers who transported captives, and local merchants who organized slave auctions in the ports. Children were separated from their mothers, families were destroyed, and every body had a price. The younger and healthier, the higher the value. Profit was not only in forced labor, but in the entire chain of buying and selling people. Slavery was so profitable that it became indispensable for the Portuguese crown. Taxes collected from the slave trade provided resources to finance wars and maintain the administrative machinery of the empire. It was a perverse cycle. The more enslaved people arrived, the stronger the system became, and the stronger it became, the more dependent it was on this labor force. But there was also a silent cost: the erasure of human dignity. Every lashing, every day of forced labor, every life taken by exploitation fed the fortune of a few and deepened the misery of many. The trade of souls turned Brazil into a country rich in products but poor in humanity. This blood-stained profit could not last forever. As the 19th century advanced, internal and external pressures began to question this cruel system. And if, for centuries, the slave trade had been considered normal, now voices were rising demanding the end of this inhumane practice. It is about this path toward abolition, made of gradual laws, struggles of resistance, and international pressures, that we will discuss in the next chapter. As profitable as it was for the elites, the slave system could not be sustained forever. Throughout the 19th century, internal and external pressures began to shake the foundations of slavery in Brazil. The resistance of the enslaved, the actions of the abolitionists, and international pressure created a scenario in which the continuation of the slave trade became unsustainable. One of the first blows against this system came in the year 1850 with the Eusebio de Queiroz law, which officially prohibited the slave trade. Still, many slave ships continued to disembark Africans in clandestine ports, showing how deeply rooted the slave trade was in the economy and how protected it was by networks of corruption. The decade of 1870 brought another milestone, the Free Womb Law of 1871. This law determined that all children of enslaved women born from that date forward would be considered free. In practice, however, these children remained under the guardianship of the masters until adulthood, serving as cheap labor. It was another slow, insufficient step, but one that showed the growing pressure for change. In the year 1885 came the law of the sexagenarians, which granted freedom to enslaved people over 60 years old, a measure seen by many as a farce, since the life expectancy of those who lived in slave quarters and in the fields was extremely low. While these partial laws were being created, black resistance did not cease. Quilombos continued to emerge, escapes intensified, and urban movements gained strength. Intellectuals, journalists, and abolitionist leaders such as Joaquim Nabuco, José do Patrocínio, and André Rebouças used newspapers, speeches, and mobilizations to expose the cruelty of slavery. Cities began to host rallies, marches, and campaigns that gave voice to popular indignation. Finally, on May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, officially extinguishing slavery in Brazil. It was the last country in the West to abolish the slave system, more than 300 years after the beginning of the trade of souls. But despite the celebrations recorded in the streets, abolition did not immediately bring dignity, reparations, or social inclusion for the formerly enslaved. Without land, without compensation, and without opportunities, millions of freed black people were left to fend for themselves, perpetuating inequalities that echo to this day. Abolition was, without a doubt, a historic milestone, but it was also an incomplete freedom, achieved at the cost of much pain and struggle. And it is precisely at this point that we need to reflect what remains as the inheritance of this system. In the next chapter, we will see how the legacy of slavery is still present in structural racism and social inequality in contemporary Brazil. The signing of the Golden Law in the year 1888 legally ended slavery in Brazil, but it did not erase the deep scars left by more than 300 years of exploitation. The so-called trade of souls was abolished on paper, but the legacy of slavery remained alive in the daily life of the country. It is impossible to understand contemporary Brazil without recognizing how structural racism and social inequality are direct consequences of this past. When black people were freed, they did not receive land, compensation, or any kind of state support. With no alternatives, many continued to work in the same sugar mills, coffee farms, and gold mines, now as cheap labor. Exclusion was the mark of abolition. Millions of men, women, and children were thrown to the margins of society, condemned to poverty. This historical abandonment was reflected across generations. While the descendants of plantation owners maintained privileges, the descendants of the enslaved had to fight for survival. The slave quarters were replaced by tenements, slums, and outskirts. Brazilian social structure was organized in a way that perpetuated inequality, and the whipping post ceased to be physical only to become a symbol of daily violence. But the legacy of slavery was not only pain, it also expressed itself in cultural resistance. Music, cuisine, capoeira, African-based religions, and so many cultural manifestations that enrich Brazil are the fruits of African heritage preserved despite oppression. The Brazilian national identity is inseparable from the contribution of the peoples who were forcibly brought on slave ships. Still, the struggle continues. Structural racism blocks equal opportunities. The labor market reflects historical exclusion, and the invisibility of black stories reinforces erasure. Brazil carries the mark of having been the last country in the West to abolish slavery, and that heritage weighs heavily. Recognizing this is not just looking back, but an essential step toward transforming the present. And it is with this reflection that we approach the end of this narrative. In the next and final chapter, we will revisit the entire trajectory of this trade of souls, pay tribute to the resistance of the enslaved, and propose a reflection on how the memory of slavery can guide us in building a more just future. There were more than 300 years of slavery in Brazil. 3 centuries in which millions of Africans were captured, transported on slave ships during the dreaded passage of death, sold in slave markets, forced to live in slave quarters, and punished at the whipping post. 3 centuries in which the sweat, the blood, and the lives of men, women, and children sustained sugar mills, gold mines, and coffee plantations, generating wealth for a few and misery for many. But despite all the pain, this is also a story of resistance. From the quilombos, such as Palmares, which rose as symbols of freedom, from the rebellions, such as the Malê Revolt, which showed that hope never died, from the preservation of African culture in songs, religions, and dances that crossed the centuries and shaped the identity of the Brazilian people. Every act of resistance was proof that slavery never managed to completely erase the dignity of a people. The Golden Law of 1888 officially ended this cruel system, but the freedom achieved was incomplete. Without reparations, without support, without land, and without rights, the formerly enslaved were left to fend for themselves. The weight of this abandonment is still felt today in the structural racism and social inequality that mark the reality of Brazil. The past did not end in 1888. It echoes on every corner, in every statistic, in every life still affected by exclusion. Remembering this history is not just about revisiting suffering, but also about recognizing the strength of a people who resisted and will continue to resist. The trade of souls that lasted for more than 300 years left deep scars, but it also left seeds of struggle, faith, and hope that continue to flourish. That is why this narrative is more than a dive into the past. It is an invitation to reflect on the present and the future. Understanding the history of slavery in Brazil is to understand our roots, to see the origin of inequalities, and to take responsibility for building a fairer country where no one is judged by the color of their skin. And now I ask you, do not let this history be forgotten. Share this video so that more people can learn the truth about the 300 years of slavery that shaped Brazil. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and continue with us on this journey of memory, justice, and awareness. Because only when we look the past straight in the face can we change the present and transform the future.